On March 30th of last month, the Atlanta City Council held a little meeting that's going to possibly change what happens entirely to the short-term rental market in Atlanta and make changes to the ordinance that was passed last year that so many people found very controversial. And in this video, I'm going to give you guys some insight about how that can affect your properties, whether you're thinking about making one in the future or you're already grandfathered in and you're a host right now. You're going to want to stick to the end of this video because there's some make it break it things for the short-term rental market going forward. Number one right here, we got the list. We're having the elimination of a primary residence requirement, which actually is a good thing for most people, especially if you're already a host. Most people have to literally have their primary residence in the city. If you're outside the city, you're not able to have an Airbnb because of this rule. Make sure that you have to have at least one primary residence inside the city. And the elimination of this rule actually really helps people both inside and outside the city. If you're outside the city, you're able to have Airbnbs and short-term rentals in the city now because you're not stuck with needing a primary residence. If you're in the city and you have your primary residence and you have another short-term rental as well, you get the additional bonus of being able to apply another short-term rental. So you don't have to have your primary residence as a short-term rental, and most likely you will now be able to have two short-term rentals, of which none of them are your primary residence. So that is good to see. Moving on to number two, and this one is a bit weird. It's kind of worded oddly considering some of the other ones contradict it, but it's saying that every dwelling unit now must have its own individual license. So before, the licensee itself only needed a license. So if you have a license, then you'd have your primary residence and another property at max, and then you really wouldn't need another license. But this one says that you'll likely need a license, which is $150 each. Not too much if you're doing well in your Airbnbs, but still, it's another thing you got to pay for. Each dwelling will have its own license. So, just one more hoop you got to jump through. Moving on to number three right here, it says no single family structure may be located 2,000 feet from another short-term rental. So basically what's that saying, I did mess it up a little bit, is no short-term rental that's an individual home itself, a detached property, can be within 2,000 feet of another one. And this is actually huge. When I was talking about what can make or break possible people entering the future, this is it right here. It won't really have so much of an effect on host right now because you're able to be grandfathered in. But if you're thinking about making an Airbnb in the future, this is something that could really affect everybody. So they're currently trying to get it decreased to 1,500. Again, this is just people talking. This isn't actual legislation being passed, but it's something that could possibly show up down the road. And I just want you guys to know. So they're trying to get it decreased to 1,500. But the implications of this is that everyone that is not grandfathered in, there's so many Airbnbs, I believe now a little over 10,000 short-term rentals in the market. Just the vast density of this will create basically an oversaturated market. So if you have an area of the map right here and you try to stick another one in, there will be no section of the map that's not within 2,000 feet of another short-term rental just because there's so many in the city itself. And this is probably a good thing because Atlanta really has a housing crisis. There's an extreme shortage of housing in the city, and this is good in that regard. But if you are trying to get an Airbnb, this is not such good news to you and can really affect what you do with your future plans here. So moving on to number four, for all multifamily structures between 3 and 12 units, they can only be capped at 33% short-term rentals. So the rule before only applies to single-family homes. It doesn't apply to condos. So the condo rule actually isn't a thing. So if you're a condo in one area and you have another condo here, and they're within 2,000 feet of each other, they can actually both be short-term rentals, and they're not affected by that rule. And number three, however, the 33% rule does apply, and this actually might make multifamilies even more popular because if you can't get into short-term rentals as a single-family home, you can get into them as a multifamily, and this might actually make it a lot harder on the multifamily side to actually even get a property. And it may see people just building them in of themselves and incentivizing people to really densify in certain neighborhoods, which isn't really necessarily a bad thing because Atlanta has such bad urban sprawl. And then moving on with number five, we're just going to roll right into it. It's basically the same thing as number four, but it just applies to any units over 13 plus. They're just no more than 15% of them can be short-term rentals. And this is probably going to affect the very most dense areas, places like Buckhead, really just in the heart of Buckhead in the Lenox area. Downtown and Midtown are probably going to be the only places really affected by this. Maybe some apartment complexes where people have Airbnbs, but this is something that you're really going to see in those highly dense areas. All right, so now for my thoughts on this. Also, one, yes, I did change my clothes, and two, yes, I did change the camera angle. I just wasn't feeling the past footage, so we had to redo this. But my thoughts on this are that one of three things can play out, with number one being that newcomers are going to have next to an impossible time finding an Airbnb versus anyone who is already a host as of now. The reason being is because of this 2,000 foot rule. People are going to have such a hard time if the market becomes saturated and there's no more space for Airbnbs in the Atlanta market. Not a bad thing for everybody else, but if you are looking at an Airbnb, you're going to be out of luck on this one, because once it fills up, you're going to be having to buy other Airbnbs, which rolls into number two. And also, if you look at condominiums, which might rise as a result of this, you're going to quickly see them fill up, as there's a 33% rule and a 15% rule. Moving on to number two, though, like I mentioned before, you might actually see the property intrinsically increase in value itself because of this. And typically, people tend to think Airbnbs are more valuable just because they are an Airbnb, but they're not more valuable than any equivalent property. And people tend to get this confused, but it's really not the case. An Airbnb is literally the same price as any other property. And the reason being is because when you sell your Airbnb, the account and the business itself is not tied to your property. The account that sticks up in the Airbnb listings that gets so high and is always looked at as number one is tied with the account itself. So if you have great ratings, you're a great host, and you're really stuck up there in the Airbnb listings, that doesn't matter for the property. Once the property is sold, it goes to someone else, and it could go way down to the bottom of the list. So the thing that's different here is, and it's actually pretty weird, is that the property, since there are qualifications to have it be an Airbnb at all with this 2,000 foot rule, it's actually going to be pretty interesting, because that can't change, and that's more or less tied to the property itself. So it might make it more valuable to other people, especially if you get in this oversaturated place. And really, people are going to be wanting to bid up on these properties because they fit the qualifications and they can't find an Airbnb anywhere else. So it actually might rise the prices of some of these properties. Did I say rise, raise, whatever? Number three is probably the most probable one, I would say, because it just has the highest chance of being passed. And the reason that is because it won't really affect the market too much more than it's already being affected. And that's if the permanent residency clause is removed, that you're just going to see more investor activity outside the city come into the city. And that's not really anything different, because there's already so much investor activity inside Atlanta itself. It's not really going to change the actual market overall too much, but it might make the Airbnb market just a little bit more hot. But I want to know what you guys think. I think it's pretty interesting what's happening here. Whether these regulations get passed or not, I have no idea. Again, this is just a city council meeting. It's not at all going to actual legislation. No one's voting on it as of yet, but it is pretty interesting to see what the implications of this are. And again, I'm Steve Carson. If you guys are looking to buy, sell, or invest in the Atlanta area, I'm your guy. So be sure to check out my information in the description below. I'm happy to help, and let me know. But until then, thanks guys. Have a nice day.